In this video, we're going to go through a step-by-step process that can sort of serve as a checklist for building and launching your no-code app. Now, this is going to be like a high-level overview of the process that we take our own clients through when they're going from their idea to launching their app. And it's what I suggest you move forward with as well when you're building and preparing to launch your app. Now, make sure you stick around until the end because we're going to cover everything in this process so that you can take yourself from just being in that idea and maybe that initial planning and research stage to actually confidently being able to start bringing those initial users on board your app. So make sure you stick around until the end for that. Now, first, if you're new around here, my name is Kristen, and I'm the co-founder of Coaching No Code Apps, where we help business owners and industry experts build custom apps to either start their app-based businesses or grow their existing businesses, all without coding and with no technical background required. So we're going to dive right into this, and I'm going to share my screen with you. We're going to jump over to the whiteboard here. Now you can see on my screen these four different words: framework, foundation, function, and expand. And the process that we take clients through for creating and being able to launch their apps, it involves these four stages. And within these stages are a number of steps that you should be going through to work up to that launch. And while this is not technically a checklist format, you can kind of use these as an overarching checklist to guide you forward from here. Now, if you look at the top left here, this is really where we start with the idea, the app idea. And once we get down to here, this is where we are approaching our launch. Now, the first phase in this process is the framework phase. And there are a few different components to this, or at least a few different main components. I'm just going to touch on the main ones here to keep it a little bit more concise for you. But within the framework phase, you really want to be creating the underlying strategy that you're going to be using to take your app through its development, prepare it for launch, and then actually onboard those initial test and beta users. Now, the very first thing you want to do, and a lot of people skip over this because it's really exciting to think about diving into actually putting the app together and technically bringing your app idea to life. And so going through this framework phase and going through these steps can feel a little bit like holding back and waiting, but it's really important to lay this framework down before you head forward. And the first thing you really need to do is make sure that you have the right goal identified for this launch. Now, we follow a soft launch process. That's the methodology that we guide people through. Is instead of having kind of like a grand opening type of launch, follow a soft launch process where you can launch a little bit smaller, but launch a lot sooner so that you can start building up traction earlier with your app. So when you think about having multiple launches versus one big one, what you have to do is start attaching really specific goals to each one of those launches. So that could look like launching to alpha users and making sure that a certain segment of the functionality of your app works as it should and will solve the problem that your app is being designed to solve. Okay, and then moving on to your beta testing. Maybe your goal is to get a very specific type of feedback on a very specific set of features. And maybe it's to onboard X number of beta users into your first beta group. That would be dependent on you, your goals, your app, your target market, and all of that. But that's an example of one of those initial goals. And then you can expand from there. You can expand your beta groups in different waves or in expanding waves. And then you can work out to really just rolling out the app from there. But you can kind of imagine how many different small or soft launches would happen during a process like that. In order to successfully have a rollout of your app that follows that sort of plan or process, you got to have individual, very precise goals that you're working towards. Otherwise, you will be building and strategizing with no clear destination in sight. And I've said this before, I've made this comparison, but it's kind of like sprinting in 10 or 20 different directions all at once. You're going to burn yourself out, but you're not really going to get anywhere. So, when you are preparing for this initial launch down here, right, make sure you have a really clear goal as to what you're looking to accomplish with that launch. Now, when you have that goal, you need to get really clear on your app's technical scope. Now, most people start with the technical scope. They think about their app idea for a really long time, and they envision this really massive app with tons of features and functionality, and they just start building it, right? But what you really want to do is you want to create the scope that takes you directly towards that goal that you've identified. So, what technical scope, so what features, what functionality within your app will actually allow you to achieve that goal that you've set? Figure that out and don't build anything beyond that yet because you don't need to yet. If you want to launch quickly, launch soon, and build really early traction with your app, then create the scope that lets you attain this initial launch goal and then continue to expand it from there. If you have the goal, then you can figure out the scope and you can actually do it strategically versus thinking about, all the cool features that your app could have. You want to try to avoid doing it that way. Actually have a specific reason for building the things that you're planning to build at certain times. You want to build the right things at the right time in the right order. Okay, so have your goal outlined. That's going to directly influence your scope. And then from there, you really just need to get focused. This is very simple, but it needs to be said because it can be as much as you want to move into actually bringing that app idea to life, it can be very hard to definitively take the next step and actually create the app. It can be really hard to confidently move out of your planning stage and move forward with the app without just going back and forth again and again and again and second guessing yourself and all of that. A lot of people do. They try to move forward with their development and their launch, but they're constantly second guessing themselves. And it's because they did not lay the framework in either of these areas. Okay, but if you've laid that framework, then you can confidently move forward. If you've laid the framework, then you need to get focused and actually take that next step. So focus in. Remember that you're building the first version. Your app doesn't need to be perfect. So if you are prone to perfection, like many of us are, then you need to try to push past that and remember you're focusing on these immediate goals, this immediate scope, and you just need to follow through with that so you can actually get your app into users' hands and start growing it from there. Okay, so you have the framework down. The next step is to move into this foundation phase. Again, this involves a number of different things, but for the purpose of keeping you moving forward through this process, I'm going to highlight two specific areas that I want you to focus on here. The first one is your database creation. When you move into the technical development of your app, you have to lay the foundation. And you can think of this like building a house. I use this comparison a lot because it's really fitting. But when you're building a house, you have to lay the foundation first because it's what supports everything else that goes on top of that. You can't have the, fancy artwork or the fun paint colors or whatever it is. You can't have any of that until you have the foundation under the home. So in the case of creating an app, the database is your foundation. And we always guide entrepreneurs on creating their database first, considering this as the foundation, because it makes your development overall a lot more seamless and a lot more organized. Because if you focus on laying this foundation, you can then move on to the next step, which will be creating the framework of the front end of your app. And then you can connect those two pieces because your app is really three parts. It's the back end, it's the front end, and it's the thing or the logic connecting those two parts, right? So if you lay the back end out all at once and then you lay the front end out, then you can connect the two. Now, most people, when they are approaching their app development, especially non-technical entrepreneurs who are new to building apps, which is, if you're in the no-code space, then that's very likely the case with you. It can be hard to figure out how to strategically approach your development, right? And how to move through development efficiently and effectively and not run into a bunch of different obstacles and not constantly backtrack. A lot of people, when they start building their apps, they build whatever they feel like building at the time, or they build whatever new idea they've come up with most recently, or they just build whatever they've learned how to build so far. And they kind of dip into the database, the front end, the workflows and logic, and they just kind of jump around. This really creates more of a piecemeal app. And it's kind of like a hacked together app. Very rarely is it scalable, efficient in the long run. So we want to avoid problems that come along with that in the long term. Lay the foundation, which starts with our database. Keep in mind that your database can and should evolve over time. So when you're in this stage, make sure that your database is directly reflective of this goal and this scope that you are focusing on. And as you evolve the app afterwards, and as you continue to roll it out, then your database can also evolve and grow alongside your app. Okay, but keeping that in mind will help keep you focused on what you need right now and the most immediate. Now, I touched on this, but the next step then is really focusing on the overall architecture of your app. So we'll just call this the front end. But really, what you're focusing on here is not about designing your entire app. When you talk about design, what comes to most people's minds is creating a really sleek, fancy front end of their app, finding really nice graphics or images, creating a really fancy logo and things like that. That's not what I'm talking about here. What we're talking about when creating the front end of your app is creating the pages that you need or the groups that you need if you're not going to have multiple pages, making sure that the app is navigable. So a user could go from one page or screen or group to the next and the next, and actually just be able to navigate to different areas of the app. This can involve having global navigation, having your menus set up. Think about going back to our home analogy, right? We have the foundation, which is that database. Well, the front end is kind of like creating the frame of the home, right? When you walk in to that frame, you may have done this if you've been to a home construction site. There's nothing there, but you can still see the footprint of the home. Okay, so that's really what we're talking about here. So you have the database and you have the front end, you have the foundation of the home, and you have the frame. So the footprint is all there. You can walk through the house and you can kind of imagine what it would look like once you have, all of your, your walls up and your whatever, your furniture and your decorations and all of that kind of stuff. Okay. So once you have that, that's going to take us into our next phase. And this is where things usually start to get the most exciting in terms of development, because this is where you start working on a lot of the niche or custom functionality of your app. So you can really start realizing all of those ideas that you've been thinking about and planning on for so long now. So what we start doing here is we start creating a lot of the logic. So really, we are looking back at our foundation. We're just connecting these two things, right? We're just making sure that both sides of our app work together so that we, as the app owner, the administrator, can control this backend, and end users can come on and they can interact with the front end, and all works together seamlessly. So we're working on the logic. We are starting to create a little bit more of that front end context. So I'll say front end context here. And what I mean by that is really just making sure that users can come on and start to interact with the app, right? They can create data, manage data, edit data, and all of that kind of stuff. And this doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't be, really fancy and sleek design like we kind of touched on. It should be simplified. It should be straightforward, and it should be usable. That's a key word that I want you to keep in mind. Make sure it's usable. The extra touches, the extra user experience touches, the nice to haves, those types of things, those can come later. You really want to make sure it's usable here. So, and that really lives up to the name of this stage, really, which is function, right? We want to create a functioning product. So once we have that, then we're going to head up into this last phase, which is the expand phase. Now, this is where we get a little bit more advanced. And the way in which you go through this expand phase, it depends on the needs for your app and your most immediate goals for this launch that we talked about down here. But this could involve working with APIs here and leveraging different APIs to expand your app, add on different services. Now, there is one caveat here. Depending on your app, you may look to working with APIs earlier on in this process. You might add APIs in, get my red here, in the function stage. More often than not, it makes more sense to wait on it, but it is going to involve a little bit of dipping back into the function just because of the nature of development. You have to connect that in and kind of make it work seamlessly with the surrounding features and that type of thing. Again, it depends on what your app is and the scope that you have initially, but just know that if you haven't started building your app yet, you don't already need to be figuring out the APIs. If you need a certain API, then yes, you want to make sure that you can connect it with your app. But it's okay if you don't know all the details of actually how to go in and do that yet. Start with the basics. Make sure you have the foundation that is even going to allow you to set up the API. And then you can come and kind of dive into the setup later on, because not only will you then have the actual foundation of your app itself to add on that API, but when you go through each of these processes, your own skills, knowledge, and expertise are going to grow exponentially. And so if you learn all of these things and you get comfortable with all of these stages, then once you get over here and you start working with APIs or more advanced components, it's going to be a heck of a lot easier. It can feel really intimidating to try and figure out something like this right at the very start, but you have to kind of approach this in steps, approach this in different layers, and build up your own expertise as well. Okay, So we have any integrations that we need to do. We know that we might be kind of dipping back and forth a little bit to make sure we have the setup all right. And then from there, you really want to move into your testing. Now, testing, it's part of the process. A lot of people, they get to this very end step where it feels like their app is pretty much finished and they are so close to launching it, but they haven't tested yet. And then when you start testing and you realize that there's still a lot to do, it can feel kind of like a setback, but it's not. Know that testing is part of this. It's going to involve time. Testing can be a little bit tedious, but that's just part of the nature of development. Now, you do want to be testing throughout the stages as you go, but then once you actually have that core of your app created, you want to go through and test the whole thing for each different user type, for all the different processes that you have. You want to test all the processes together instead of testing them individually. Now, know that there can be some ripple effects as you make fixes, updates, and changes. When you are testing all of the different components of your app together versus separately as you've built them, everything is intertwined. And so if you make a fix or a change to one component of the app, you want to test everything that's related to that or that surrounds that too, because you could unknowingly affect something else in the app. And so you change one thing or you fix one thing, and then something else stops working. And so if you test everything that surrounds it, it helps you keep everything isolated, and it just makes your testing process a lot cleaner and a lot faster. It helps you stay a lot more sane throughout that process as well. So you test the app, you make sure that any user type you're bringing on can go through the app, and then you want to just onboard. You want to onboard those initial test users. Now, this is where we start looking back at the framework that we set up. So you want to, throughout the whole process, and ideally before you've started this process, you want to be having conversations with your target market. You want to be listening to how they talk about the problem that you're going to be solving, how they talk about the solutions that they need, how they talk about the solutions that they're currently using, why those aren't working. Right? You want to be really keeping your ear to the ground on all of this so that when you get to the point of being able to onboard these initial beta users, you actually can, because you've been doing the outreach, you've been having the conversations, and you've been creating connections and relationships and all of that. Now, there's lots and lots of different ways that you can do outreach, that you could do your onboarding, so we won't dive into all of that, but know that once you get over to the bottom right, where you are preparing to launch, you want to think back to this initial goal and make sure that you're still aligned with it. You want to make sure that when you do start onboarding your users, that you are still focused on that goal so that you can achieve the outcome, which will let you then make your way towards the next goal. It's really easy to just start bringing users on board and then to kind of forget everything. Right? Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face, right? Not that launching is like a punch in the face, but once you start bringing users on board, then you have other components, other pieces at work. It's not just you in your office at your desk tinkering away at your app. It's you actually providing a product for other people and uh, providing some sort of solution for their businesses, for their lives, right? So it's easy to get to that point and then kind of forget all of your strategy. But you want to make sure that you're still focused so that you can get the right feedback from them. And so you can continue to evolve and actually grow your app versus launching and then kind of just working to stay afloat. You actually want to create forward momentum. You want to make sure that you are really focused on that initial scope. Try your hardest not to get down here where you're ready to move into this launch phase, but then just keep building and building and building. It can be intimidating to launch because you might feel like your app is not perfect yet. That's because your app shouldn't be perfect yet. Your app can't be perfect really ever, but you can't be close to perfect unless you have users telling you how to achieve perfection. It's not possible unless the users are on board. So remember that you're launching version 1. You're moving past that perfection that you might have or that you might be prone to. You're sticking to this initial scope, and you are letting users give you feedback in order to dictate what should be included in your next most immediate scope. Okay, so stick to that, and then like we said here, stay focused. Now, if you follow the lean startup methodology at all, you might have heard about the build, measure, learn cycle, where you build, you test, and then you intake feedback, and then you just go right back to the start and you implement that feedback. So you build, and then you measure, you test, and then you kind of go back in cycles. And that's why we have found ourselves now looking back at our goal, our scope, and that focus that we have. And it's because you really do just continue this in a cycle over and over and over again. Now, when you start bringing users on board and you get their feedback, you don't have to go through each of these individual steps like they're here, but you still do need to go back through the building phase. So when you are adding on new features, for example, you still need to go back through these steps, but now you're just letting user feedback dictate that. All right. So this whole process here will take you from your idea stage to being able to onboard those initial users. So I encourage you to use this as a sort of like a checklist. I know we don't have granular, little checklist components on here, but consider it to be something like that, and at least an overall guideline to help your development and launch process flow more effectively, and just to help you launch more quickly and just smart, like help you launch in a really smart and strategic way so that you're not wasting time, you're not backtracking, and all of those things. So I hope you found this helpful. Now, if you are wanting to follow a process like this, we do have a free training that does a lot more of a deep dive on some of these components. It's going to help you scope out that strategic first version of your app. It's going to help you understand some of the tech components that are going to be involved. And it's really just going to help make sure that you're moving forward as strategically as possible with your app. So if you're starting out with your app, or if you've maybe just started, but you want to do kind of a gut check and make sure you're headed in the right direction, then you can head to coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop. And you can sign up for that there, and just do a deeper dive into all of this and make sure you're getting your app up and running in the best way possible. All right, again, I hope that's helpful for you. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.